Broadcasting live from somewhere underneath the ground. Archaeology News, the news you can trust.
All right, just a couple of quick stories for this week's Archaeology News. First, an interesting little tidbit just popped up about Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and because we just did a site visit there, I'm of course going to have to cover that one. Now, it's not strictly speaking archaeology, but it is genetics, so that's something we talk quite a lot about. Fair game on this show. Well, if you'll recall, the island and its people were devastated in the 19th century due to the activities of missionaries on the island from mainland Chile and the other Europeans that showed up who had designs on how to exploit the island. Now, one of the ventures they had in mind was winemaking, and of course that had been already traditionally imported into mainland Chile, where it became kind of a traditional industry in the country. Okay, not that traditional, but you get the idea. Well, fast forward to 2021, and a modern vineyard was established on Easter Island, which will hopefully bring some sustainable economic development there to supplement the tourism which is going on. Now, of course, it turns out this is not the first time winemaking has been done there. You see, wild grapes were already growing all over the island, and those were left over from that long ago winemaking venture by the missionaries and Europeans. And we know this thanks to some documentary evidence from that time. You see, way back in 1860s, those missionaries who would go on to screw up the island so badly were in charge. And they had a problem because they needed wine for their weekly mass. And as we know, Rapa Nui is so isolated that trading ships were very, very few and far between. So they had some vines brought from the mainland, which they planted near the church in Hangarau with the intention of making wine. And voila, you've got a winemaking industry. And as you see, those missionaries got it right, that the conditions in Rapa Nui were comparable to that of another volcanic island, Madeira, which of course was a hotbed for viticulture. And having been to Madeira, I can tell you that they definitely know how to make a good vintage there. In fact, Madeira was the source of most of the wine imports for the early United States back before, when it was a colony, before independence, and even after independence in the early days of the Republic. Well, as you probably remember, on Rapa Nui, the whole colonialism thing didn't work out too well. And pretty soon, those missionaries were fighting a mini-war with that French bag, Jean-Baptiste Dutrou-Bornier, and as a result of that, both sides in that mini-war evacuated large portions of the population out of Rapa Nui to work and live elsewhere. And as a result, those grapes that were planted by the church became wild and untended. However, far from dying off, those grapes actually spread all over the island to lots of different locations. And just recently, a team of researchers thought to test those grapes genetically to see what variety they were that survived so well. And they were doing this in support of the island's new wine industry as they hope to further develop that. And they published their findings in the New Zealand Journal of Botany. And New Zealand, like Chile, as we know, is a nation that's known for its wine. So it all kind of makes sense. And man, did those grapes grow everywhere. Just look at them here all over the crater, that volcanic crater, just north of Orongo Ceremonial Village, all the way at the southern tip of the island. And overall, the team sampled sites from 13 different locations on the island. And what did they find? Well, the genome sequenced identified 5 varieties that are known from mainland Chile and beyond. And these have names like San Francisco, Muscat of Alexandria, etc. However, curiously, they found one variety whose genome didn't match any known cultivar. So you just know, given how snobbish wine fanatics can be, that some fancy sommelier is going to make that into a rare and exotic variety that's going to be served on the tables of some Michelin star restaurant somewhere. And I must say that this doesn't totally surprise me. You see, winemaking viticulture has long been a global industry, with vines making it all around the world as far back, I think, as even the 16th century. And grapes, like a lot of plants, are actually subject to pandemics. So, for example, in the 1800s in France, there was the Great Wine Blight, which destroyed a lot of the crop in that country. And little known fact, a lot of the grapes there were then imported from the US, where the grapes had built up a resistance already to the blight, which was caused by a certain pest. So France, with its great wine industry, actually has the US to thank for that. So in all that interbreeding, this little guy on Rapa Nui might be the lone survivor of a long-lost cultivar that has since disappeared in the wider world. So you go, Rapa Nui, you work that niche. Okay, so moving on to Poland, where a bear bone found in a cave way back in the 1950s is yielding new insights thanks to a paper recently published by some local researchers. Now, this bone was found in a cave that was rich with the remains of other ancient animals, wolves, foxes, you name it, dozens of varieties. This cave is in a karst region of Poland, and karst is that limestone that creates those lovely mountains in places in the world like Guilin, China, or is perfect for forming caves, like in parts of Slovenia. If you look, they even put a castle into this one. It was determined to be the rib of a bear, and you can clearly see those scratches, which were definitely made by intelligent life forms, some kind of a hominid. And based on the stratigraphic layer it was found in, and the faunal remains it was found with, we know that this bear was from approximately 115,000 to 130,000 years ago, when it's well attested that our friends the Neanderthals inhabited this region. And so, based on that dating way back to what was called the Eemian period, and the regularity of those scratch marks, this piece of bone was named probably the earliest piece of representational or symbolic art in Europe, and it therefore became a very famous item. However, there's one problem. Those judgments were all made on the basis of simple observation. The bone itself was never really subjected to any rigorous scientific observation, so that's exactly what this team did. Now, the paper isn't quite clear on this point, but that actually was misidentified as a rib bone. It was not a rib bone of a bear, it was the radius of a bear. But what isn't clear to me is if this current team was the one who made that correction, or if that had already been done earlier by other researchers. Moreover, based on the lack of fusion in the bones and traces of the muscle attachments, the team determined that this was a juvenile bear, probably a brown bear, which still roam Europe today. I actually saw one in Slovenia. Anyway, they subjected the bone to lots of high-tech analyses using advanced microscopes, laser scanning, microphotogrammetry, basically taking super close-up 3D images. And using these techniques, they were able to get really, really precise measurements of those scratches, like the depth, the angles, etc. Then they did a bunch of experimental archaeology to see if they could replicate these cut marks. And what did they find? First of all, given the regularity, they determined this was done in one sitting. And there was also no useful purpose to making the cut, so this isn't consistent with butchering. Second, they determined that the cut marks were made with a retouched stone tool, and based on our K for napping that we did this week, you know exactly what that means, a retouched stone tool. And finally, they were able to determine, based on the angle of the cut marks, that it was a right-handed person that made them. It's amazing how much science can teach us about the minute details of technology and activity long ago. However, I do have one problem with this paper, which is that I think it's overinterpreted. I think they're making a little bit too much of a stretch in their determination about what this means. Now, I'm not casting aspersions on this particular team, but I do, again, think it was a little bit of a stretch to say that this is definitely an example of representational or symbolic artwork. And it's not because I don't think Neanderthals were capable of that. In fact, we know they were. They painted stuff with pigments for ornamental purposes. In fact, some of those cave paintings we've discussed a few times, those were made by Neanderthals, like this one here in Spain. So it's not that I think Neanderthals were incapable of making this type of artwork. Yet, just because these cut marks were regular, deliberate, and done with no particular utilitarian purpose, does not necessarily make them an example of representational art. Now, how do I know this? I sort of unwittingly did an ethnographic experiment myself. Now, when I was a kid, probably 8 or 9 years old, my parents bought me my first knife for fishing and sailing and other outdoor kind of stuff. And I remember one day just sitting there kind of by an old table at my house, just kind of scoring it with a knife, making regular tick marks. Now, these marks were deliberate, they were regular, and they were done in one sitting without any utilitarian purpose in mind. But were they art? No. I was actually just bored. I wasn't even paying attention to what I was doing. And guess what? My parents were not happy with the results of my labors. And that's something that's often overlooked about past times. Life must have actually been really boring. Other than hunting, sleeping, eating, there really wasn't a whole lot to do. There weren't very elaborate cultures and rituals that took up a lot of time in non-necessary type of stuff. So people had a lot of time on their hands to play with their stone tools and to make their stone tools. So on this piece of bone, that's very well what could have been going on. Someone was just bored and making cut marks on the bone. So I'm not saying the team who interpreted this is wrong. I'm just saying I'm skeptical. And that's how you critically read the archaeology news. You're allowed to use your own brain. Don't just blindly trust the experts. All right, so that's the archaeology news for this week. See you next time. Hey, if you like what you heard, give me that thumbs up below, hit that bell to subscribe, or if you want to support more independent archaeology content, consider contributing to my Patreon, where you can enjoy some exclusive members-only benefits and other goodies. Until the next dig.